Hi everyone, my name is Amisha O'Connor, and today I will be presenting the 1976 Seveso chemical disaster that took place in Italy. During the presentation, I will begin by discussing the purpose and objectives, followed by what happened during the incident, the environmental impact, health impact, economic impact, and wrap up with a summary. Outlined here are the key objectives of this presentation that you will understand upon its completion. So what happened on July 10th, 1976? Well, an incident occurred at a chemical plant in Meta, Italy. The plant was making trichlorophenol for cosmetics and medicine. A valve malfunctioned and released a dangerous chemical cloud known as TCDD dioxin. The wind carried the cloud, contaminating land and plants in Seveso and nearby areas. This resulted in harmful health and environmental impacts. Figure 1 shows a flowchart of the events leading up to the explosion. Figure 2 examines the zones most impacted by the chemical plant. The exposure classification was based on residents. Zone A housed 736 residents who were evacuated 2 weeks after the explosion. Immediate medical examinations and clinical tests were conducted, and contaminated homes were later destroyed. Zone A had the highest level of contamination. Zone B was the next most contaminated area, which had around 5,000 residents. Medical examinations and tests were administered, and pregnant women and children under 12 were relocated. Although not evacuated, residents was cautioned against consuming the grown produce and poultry. Zone R was least contaminated. They weren't relocated, but they were just advised against consuming the local foods. Zone non-ABR was an unexposed area. Residents in this zone did not undergo evacuation or relocation. Figure 2 shows the zones based on severity. Environmental impacts. The impact that TCDD had on the environment was large. A harmful cloud spread over a large area and affected thousands of people, animals, buildings, crops, and nearby soil. Within days, over 3,000 animals, mostly poultry and rabbits, died. Emergency slaughtering of more than 80,000 animals was quickly carried out to prevent TCDD from entering the food chain. Zone A was the most impacted, and they had to be evacuated. By the end of August in 1976, Zone A was completely evacuated. Over 1,500 people underwent examinations, revealing that 447 individuals across a variety of ages suffered from skin lesions, chloracne, and blurred vision. The figures on the right shows a man in a hazmat suit that's closing down the zone, and then you can also see the animals below that died due to the contamination of the dioxin. Now let's examine figure 3. This table examines a study done to test TCDD environmental pollution factors. TCDD percentages in soils with 3 different concentrations were examined over 350 days. In context of the Seveso disaster, the boundary between Zone A, Zone B was established was an average of TCD concentrations of less than 50 microgram per square meter. Boundaries for Zone A, Zone B, and Zone R were determined to have an average contamination of less than 50 micrograms per square meter. Dioxin distribution in the soil was monitored for 17 months and revealed that dioxin in the upper soil layer decreased to 50% in the first 5 months due to photodecomposition. Now brings us to the health impacts of TCDD. Exposure to TCDD contaminated materials is linked to chloracne, metabolic disorders, and systemic problems. There were some immediate effects for those that was exposed to the toxic cloud, such as nausea, headaches, and eye irritation. Some children was admitted to the local hospital for skin lesions on exposed body parts as a result of chloracne. In the upper right corner, you can see such children with the skin lesions. There was an urgent need for treatment for dioxin poisoning, including 187 cases of chloracne. There was also concern for long-term effects on babies, and a 2008 study assessed lasting impacts on thyroid function. Those from Zone A, the most highly contaminated area after the 1976 incident, were 6.6 times more likely to have high blood TSH levels compared to those from the surrounding areas. And continuing with the health impacts caused from the dioxin, let's examine figure 4. Chloracne is a rare skin condition that results in cysts and nodules and the eruption of blackheads. This is linked directly to dioxin exposure. In 1988, the CDC measured TCDD in 30 serum samples from the 1976 incident. They collected samples from 10 Zone A residents with chloracne, 10 without, and 10 from Zone non-ABR. The results confirmed significant TCDD exposure in Zone A residents, and based on the findings from the graph, the likelihood of developing chloracne seemed influenced by both individual susceptibility and exposure dose. So far, we have seen the harmful effects that occurred as the result of the chemical disaster. Cleaning up the contaminated zone was a task. 35 families from the heavily contaminated Zone A had to be relocated, businesses moved, and hundreds of homes had to be cleaned and/or demolished. Over 200,000 of soil and vegetation was removed from gardens. Debris was buried in 2 tunnels beneath Italy, and remaining houses were decontaminated, furniture replaced, and trees had to be replanted. Plant cleanup completed 6 years after the disaster. The most contaminated waste was packed in 41 lead-lined barrels and was removed in September 1982. The chemical disaster increased regulatory action in the realm of major accident hazards, specifically those related to dangerous substances related to chemicals. In 1982, the Seveso Directive was enacted, introducing a comprehensive framework of preventative measures and notifications to mitigate the risk posed by hazardous activities. Figure 5 is a chemical accident data graph. It shows major chemical accidents reported to the European Union, monitoring agricultural database from 1984 to 2017. It displays information on chemical accidents and it manages the chemical accident database. In continuing with the Seveso Directive and its impact, let's examine Figure 6. This is a pie chart that shows answers from a questionnaire done. In 14 countries, 353 groups of establishments, those specifically industrial parks, showed a domino effect. The survey responses indicate that not all countries have been following the Seveso Directive, and it resulted in a lot of harm. This also shows that Seveso authorities have work to do in keeping up with the establishment and the directives followed by such establishments. Inspections in these areas are challenging because neighboring companies, both Seveso and non-Seveso related, are closely linked. Inspectors find it difficult to make sure that every site has taken the necessary measures to prevent accidents and minimize their impact, as the directive requires. In summary, to wrap things up, the Seveso disaster of 1976 occurred at a chemical plant in Meta, Italy. It released a toxic cloud of dioxin and resulted in the evacuation of affected zones. The directive that came about as a result of the disaster was established by the European Union in 1982. It mandates preventative measures and emergency planning for major accident hazards involving dangerous substances. It also outlines safety measures to minimize chemical accident risk and mitigate their impact on people and the environment. This is important for chemical safety and preventing similar disasters from happening like the Seveso incident. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a lot.